let's take a look at this build because it is a bit different than the one we did on PC Parts Picker. First, let's take a look at the CPU that we're using. This one is exactly the same one as we were using in the virtual build in the first part of this series. This is the Ryzen 5 2600. It's a good CPU for gaming and for productivity, so you kind of get the best of both worlds. 6-core, 12-thread processor, so it's got a lot of power there for whatever you want to do with it, okay? So the RAM that we're going to be using is a Vengeance LPX from Corsair, and this is just one of these is 16 gigabytes. So I'm going to have 32 gigabytes in this system. I'm using this system for a media machine, so for streaming and stuff like that. So my wife and I can watch movies and all that good stuff, okay? We have the M.2 here. This one is the 1 terabyte, so I'll be using this for my video storage and for my photos. And this one I will be using for my operating system. So this one will be on a SATA lane, and this one is going to be on the PCI lane. So the PCI lane is faster, right? All right, next we have the Titan X Pascal. Now this thing is overkill. I already have this in one of my systems. I just took it out. So we're going to be using this one for our video card. You don't need anything this powerful, guys. You can buy a 1060 like we have again in the first part of this series, the one we got in the virtual part of this series. So you don't need anything like that. That's overkill. All right, now in terms of the motherboard, we have the exact same one with the exception of the I/O shield. This one is fixed. Okay, so this one also has RGB or more RGB options on it. So that's the difference between this one and the one that was used in our virtual build. Okay, as far as power supply goes, we have the Thermaltake 750, and this is a old power supply again that I already had. This one has existing plugs in it. You can get module power supplies that you plug the plugs into, but I don't need that. Okay, so if you guys are, you're a little more tidy, because it does make it easier. You don't have to have all these plugs on here. You can use whatever plugs you want and leave the other ones that you don't need out of your build. Okay, so what I like to personally do, you don't necessarily have to do this because the chances of something being wrong with your motherboard are pretty slim, but I've had it happen to me, so I like to take a look at it before I start installing anything on the motherboard. So if I see something that's wonky or that doesn't look right, then I can take the motherboard back and get them to check it. Okay, it's better than putting everything in there, finding out it doesn't work, and then you got to take everything out. Okay, so I've got a magnifying glass here. It's got some lights on it. Okay, so I just like to take a real quick look over top of everything, making sure that these little transistors ain't popped up and that there's nothing stuck inside of the chipset on the motherboard. Just little things like that. Make sure that your lanes are all clear. So some people may say I'm OCD, but I never seem to have problems when I do this. Okay, so it's better to be safe than sorry. That's the way I look at it. Okay, so I've actually already inspected this thing and it's in really good shape, so I'm not too worried about it. The first thing we are going to have to do though is take off these posts here, because our cooler is not going to fit in them. So let's quickly do that. All right, so a couple things that I want to say before we start installing the CPU, and that is, if you're uncomfortable with it, really uncomfortable with it, then go to a computer store if you bought your stuff online, or if you bought it at the computer store, ask them to put the CPU in there. Usually they'll do that for no cost because, well, you bought your stuff off of them. Okay, if you're really uncomfortable with it, I'm going to suggest that you try it because it's not that hard. But if you do bend a pin on there, you're going to have to get a new CPU, okay? And it's not covered under warranty. So you're taking a risk by installing these things. Not a high risk, okay? Most people can do this no problem, okay? But just to premise that. Most YouTubers will tell you to install it yourself. Don't worry about it. Well, it's not their money. Okay, so we're gonna start installing the CPU. Again, this is an A4 chip set, so this board will be an A4 chip set, so make sure that they match with each other, okay? This is the clamshell that it actually comes into, and these are the wires, so the top of the CPU and the bottom. Okay, so again, Intel will have it on the board, not on the chip. So we're going to take this out. You don't want to touch the wires too much, not only because you don't want to bend them, but also because you don't want grease on them. Okay, so you want to make sure, again, I'm using this because my eyesight's not that great, and it helps, right? On this particular board, as I was saying, on the Intel board, they have a gold arrow that is quite obvious. But on this board, it's black, right? So I just take a look and I look for that little tiny arrow in one of the corners of the board, or of where you're installing your CPU, okay? So I'll look. On this particular board, it's on this corner. On most particular boards, it's on the opposite corner of the retention lever. Okay, so all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna look for that arrow. I'll show you here if you guys can, hopefully you can see that, on the chipset, and I'm going to match it up with the arrow on the board. Now, just slowly put it in there, nice. Don't push on it. Don't press on it, okay? Give it a bit of a wiggle and it should fit in there nice and neat like, okay? Just like that. Well, first of all, don't forget to raise the retention bar here. My bad. Okay, so once more, we're gonna have to lock this thing down. Okay, so looking for those arrows, we're gonna put it in there. There we go, that fits better, obviously. Okay, and then we're gonna take our retention bar and we're gonna push it down and underneath the retention clip, just like that. Okay, so make sure you guys lift the retention bar up. Don't be stupid like me. All right, and there you go. Now your CPU is installed. All right, so the next thing we're going to install is the RAM. Okay, so the reason why I like to install the RAM next is because when you're trying to put on the CPU cooler here, sometimes it's really difficult to get the RAM in there. You know, it's a little, it's a pain in the butt. Okay, sometimes. All right, so a couple of things we're looking for. On this particular bar here, there's one longer side of pins than there is the other. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. We're just gonna correspond with this board here, okay? So where the slot is. All right, so it looks to me like this end is longer, or shorter, and this end is longer. So I'm just gonna turn this over, put it in the second slot on this particular board. Make sure you guys are checking your motherboard manual, okay? To make sure that you're going into the optimal slots. All right, some people will put them into the first slot, and it's not like it won't work. The problem is that you're not using the fastest lane possible to utilize the board's power, okay? So make sure you put it in the optimal slot. So on this particular board, it is the A2 slot, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take both hands, I'm gonna click it in, and you'll know you get it because it's a pretty satisfying little click, okay? Then we're gonna take our second here, we're gonna face it the same way, and we're going to put it in the B2 slot. Okay, so there's A1, A2, B1, and B2. Make sure you check your motherboard manufacturers or your motherboard manual, okay? Again, we're gonna click it, and you should get a nice satisfying click. You gotta remember, guys, that the cooler you keep your PC, the longer it's gonna last for you, okay? So make sure that you guys have some good thermal paste on hand at all times, because you're gonna have to clean up, change things. If you wanna change your cooler, you're gonna need thermal paste. So you might as well pick some up while you're buying all the components. Okay, so let's get this installed here. Now, one of the things that we did at the beginning of the videos, or at the beginning of the inspection of the motherboard, is we took these black pieces off here. These are actually brackets for another CPU cooler. With this particular one, we don't need that, but we do need the plate that these were attached to. So it's already installed underneath the board here. So make sure if you do get this board that you keep that installed when you go to apply your fan cooler, okay? So we're just gonna rest it on top here just like this, making sure that they line up with the holes in our board, okay? And then we'll just take our screwdriver and we're going to tighten it just a little at a time. We're gonna make sure it goes into that slot so that it does tighten up. Give it a bit of a push. Stand up for this.
Many unbearable hours later.
All right, so now that we've got the CPU cooler on, we are going to want to plug the fan header in. Okay, so the fan header is typically on the top where this board is here. It's hoping you guys can see that. Right here, there's two of them here. Okay, we're just gonna take our plug. There is corresponding slides right here that fit in with that little notch on your header. Slides in and straight down just like that. Make sure you guys plug this in. Sometimes people forget to do that, okay? Okay guys, so now that we have our CPU installed and the fan cooler, we've got our RAM installed here. The next thing we're actually gonna do is install one of our M.2, our NVMe M.2. Okay, so we're looking for our 250 gig, which is the one we're gonna use to boot up the computer. Okay, so this one there, but we need the other one here. Okay, so I have my 250 gig here. Now I've taken the liberty, there was a post that comes with the motherboard, and I've taken the liberty to actually install it on here. Okay, so some motherboards come with posts and some don't. Okay, when you're installing, so make sure you guys check again your manual to make sure they're installing the NVMe in their property. Okay, so any NVMe is going to slide inside a slot just like this, okay, and it's got a little spring action. So once you push it in, okay, it's gonna be able to push down and sit right on top of that post, okay? Then you're gonna take one of your screws that comes with it and you're going to just screw it in. Don't drop it. So all we're gonna do is we're gonna take this long pin here. This is our hook, so this basically is what secures our GPU to the motherboard with this tab here, okay? And then we're just going to line up the small pins with and the large pins with the small pins and the large pins on the motherboard, like so. Push it down until you hear a click, and you just installed your video card. Okay, so the first thing we are going to look for in our mess of plugs here is our motherboard. This is a 24 pin, drop that all over my computer, 24 pin from the power supply. We are going to plug this into our power supply on our motherboard, okay? So this is what's going to power up our motherboard. So we just take it. Now on motherboards, you want to give it a good push, and if you're trying to take it out, don't pull too hard, okay? Because you could wreck your motherboard. Motherboard pins tend to really stick in there a little bit harder than most other plugs, so just if you're taking it out, just wiggle it and pull it out. Keep the motherboard secure, okay? So it goes in just like that. The tab on the front here will click, and as you can see, we've got power. All right, I should shut that off actually. That's a good sign though, at least we know our power supply is working. All right, next, we are going to plug the CPU in. So we need to find our CPU. Now, when you're looking for these plugs, you're not just randomly looking for them and going, oh, maybe this will fit. No, these actually have descriptions on the side. So in this particular case, this one has CPU on the side. Okay, where this one is going to go is typically in the top of the board. Okay, so top left is typically where most motherboard manufacturers put it, which is this one. This is an 8-pin, and we're gonna match it up with this 8-pin. Some are 4 pins, some have two 4 pins, some have 2 8 pins. My motherboard has 2 8 pins, okay? So the heavier the load, the more pins need to be installed. So I'm not worried about cable management here. I am just going to put this in on the top of the board here, click it in, and now we have our CPU powered up. All right, so now we're gonna plug in our GPU or our video card, okay? So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna plug in our 8-pin first, and then we'll plug in our 6-pin. All right, so the 8-pin, I typically like to do it this way. I'll plug in the small one first, and then I'll plug in the big one after, because it's a bit of a pain in the butt. Now, when you're installing this in the case, it's even harder, okay? So you might have to try and squeeze them together and put them in, but I just find that that's the easiest way. Now we're gonna plug in our 6-pin, and we should have power to our GPU now. All right, so now that we have everything installed, we are going to want to install our HDMI from our GPU to our monitor. Make sure that your power supply is plugged in, and make sure that you have the flathead screwdriver we talked about in the beginning of the video. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're going to do our first boot. We will go through all of the software install, all of the optimizations for the BIOS and the software that we install in the next video. Okay, this video is getting too long as it is, and it gives you guys enough time to put your PC together. Okay, so we're gonna turn on the PC with our power supply, and we're gonna take our flathead screwdriver and we're going to connect the power switch that would typically be connected to your case, which we'll be doing in the next video as well. We're gonna connect the positive and the negative on the motherboard. Okay, so I hope that made sense, but you look for it. As you can see, we've got fans running here right now. The lights are all on. Everything seems to be working fine. If you look on the top of the board here, there's a little green light. Well, they typically go white, yellow, green, or red. Okay, that's indicating that there is, you know, an issue if it is red. In this particular case, it looks like we have everything together, except we have an error. So we have CPU fan speed error detected. This is a typical, very typical thing that happens, especially with ASUS motherboards for some reason. Okay, so it's not detecting the fan. It thinks that there's no fan on the CPU. I'm going to show you how to fix that, as well as show you how to install all of your software, optimize everything so that your computer is running perfectly. So make sure you jump on to the next video after this and watch it once you get all your components installed. We'll see you next time on Jack of All, Master of One.